Piers Morgan sat down with Scott Galloway to talk about the state of boys and men, and I have thoughts. My name is Gabriella, and I created this channel to remind people that masculinity is good.
Turning now to the issue of masculinity. Young men in particular have not been treated well by our culture in recent years. It's an issue I've spoken about and written about a lot. Boys, and I've raised three of them, are raised to expect they'll grow into greedy men who will dominate boardrooms and menace women. Society has demeaned their traditional jobs and their traditional family roles while condemning their instinctive traits as aggressive or toxic. And while all of this has been happening, young men have guiltily receded into the gutter. They're more likely to harm themselves, more likely to be kicked out of school, and more likely to fail in higher education. Many of them seem utterly terrified of speaking to women. Plenty of charismatic role models have stepped into this vacuum. Not all of them are virtuous. Professor Scott Galloway tackles all of it head on in his excellent new book, Notes on Being a Man, and he joins me now. Scott, great to have you back on Uncensored.
Pierce, thanks for having me on, and thanks for also bringing light to this issue over the last couple of years.
Yeah, you know, it's such a big issue. And I think that I did a debate yesterday, actually, about toxic masculinity. And I argued that it's never existed, that actually masculinity has been hijacked as a theme, and people have tried to brand everything toxic masculinity, but that at its heart, masculinity has a lot of great things to admire about it. If men behave badly, that doesn't mean that masculinity has grown toxic.
Yeah, I don't think there is such a thing as toxic masculinity.
So I don't think this is what the conversation should be. I think the real thing that they should be talking about is, even if that concept does have some validity and you can label some behavior as toxic masculinity, should we be using it as a label for male behavior? And I think after the last decade, obviously the answer to that is no. Because what's happened is that the term toxic masculinity has just become a rhetorical weapon that we use to just shut down men. And I think maybe it could have been a useful term that we could have used if we lived in a culture where everyone had a really solid understanding of masculinity itself, so they would be able to have a clear distinction between masculinity and the behavior or whatever we would want to label as toxic masculinity. But not even the American Psychological Association, the organization that sets the national standard for how we should interpret human behavior, can tell the difference between masculinity and toxic masculinity. I've been working on a review of it for like a year because the way that they characterize healthy masculinity and toxic masculinity, and they blur those lines, is so incredibly irresponsible. It's unbelievable. Like, they say that like competitiveness and stoicism, oh yep, that's part of toxic masculinity. You're kidding. Is there any way that you could, did you guys set out to try to pathologize men? Because if so, like, an A+ for you. And like, they call it hegemonic instead of toxic so that they can just like hide behind their misandry just a little bit. And the reality is like, if we're not using the term toxic femininity with the same gusto that we're using the term toxic masculinity, then we shouldn't use the term toxic masculinity at all, because it's created this cultural illusion that women are morally superior to men, which is obviously not true. So I think that it would be far more accurate that we conceptualize toxic masculinity as either bad behavior that isn't related to one's masculinity at all, or as an absence of masculinity, because masculinity, actual masculinity, is good. That would be a good name for a channel.
Yeah, I don't think there is such a thing as toxic masculinity. There's cruelty, there's abuse of power, there's violence, but toxic and masculinity are oxymorons. I mean, masculinity is a social construct, as is femininity, and we get to decide how to fill that vessel.
I actually don't agree that masculinity is purely a social construct, because I think if we're saying that masculinity is purely socially constructed, then we're saying it's created only by nurture and not by nature. That it's just, masculinity is something that some people thought of and we can just rewrite it however we want. And that's just not true, because masculinity was also constructed by evolution. It's also constructed biologically. It's also constructed in patterns of development. And the reality is that in a lot of cultures all over the world, they understand masculinity in very similar ways, despite existing in totally different parts of the world and having totally different cultures and totally different roles. This book, Manhood in the Making, helped me understand this a lot. This is Manhood in the Making by David Gilmour. He does a really wonderful job explaining all of the different ways that cultures understand masculinity. And I think that this is an important point, because if we're saying that something's socially constructed, then the people who don't like masculinity can just be like, oh, we can just like shame it out of the men, shame it out of the boys. But what we're actually doing is we're just teaching the men and boys to hate themselves, because we're saying this thing that's innate in you, we don't like, we want to get rid of. When in reality, it might just be part of them.
I would argue that masculinity, the three stools of masculinity, are being a provider. I think men in a capitalist society should assume at the outset of their careers they need to take economic responsibility for their household at some point, which, by the way, might mean at some point being more supportive and stepping out of the way of your partner who is better at that whole money thing.
You had me in the first half, Scott, not gonna lie. I notice, like, in a lot of my friendships, a lot of the women make more money than the men, and a lot of the women are in more white-collar work, and a lot of the men are in more blue-collar work, and it's a dynamic that works really well when both people are respectful of each other and both people are secure in their roles. And I think that that actually is a really good showing of masculinity, that a man who is like, no, like, I make less, but I also bring value to this relationship by just existing, by just being a man, because men do bring something to the table by just being a man, of course. So I think it's about security and it's about flexibility and gender roles. So good job, Scott, on that one.
I think that's also being masculine. Two, the whole point of prosperity is to move to protection. If you think of the most masculine jobs, firefighter, cop, military, at the end of the day, they protect.
Yes, and also to continue on my rampage, that we need to expand how we think about the tenets of masculinity. We need to recognize that there are a lot of ways to protect people that aren't just physical, and those should be included in the definition of masculinity if we want that definition to be most accurate. Because you can protect people by having knowledge. You can protect people by protecting their feelings. You can protect people by advising them. You can protect people by having a really strong set of values and always telling the truth, for instance. You can protect people by being a great leader. And all of those forms of protection can be deeply masculine. So please do not fall into the trap of thinking that the only way to be protective in a masculine way is to be physically protective, because that's not true.
And then finally, and this is a little bit to your point, procreation. I think we have pathologized men wanting to have romantic and, quite frankly, sexual relationships. And I think that fire can be of wanting to have sex, quite frankly, can be destructive. It can lead to misogyny or violence. But for the vast majority of men, their desire to have a physical and romantic relationship with someone channels them into a better man.
I'm not sure how I feel about procreation being included as a tenet of masculinity. I will have to think about that more, because I think that there are absolutely ways that you can be very masculine without wanting to procreate, and the same is true with femininity. But I do agree that we've pathologized male sex drive, of course. Like, that's a really good point that he's making here.
Dress better, smell better, have a plan, demonstrate kindness, develop the resilience to approach somebody knowing you may be rejected. These are incredibly important attributes. In addition, surveys show 80% of women still want men to express, to be the initiator of romantic interest. And one of the scariest stats I've seen is that 45% of men 18 to 24 in America have never approached a woman in person.
I really empathize with men here, because especially for the younger men, with the emergence of social media right during the Me Too movement, I think what happened is they got really lambasted for men are just inherently dangerous, inherently predatory, and I think a lot of men internalized that and were like, okay, well, I don't want to make women uncomfortable. So I think a lot of their lack of desire to approach women is not just oh, they don't have the skills. I think a lot of it is they genuinely don't want to make people uncomfortable, and it's made it very difficult for them. And also, we kind of exist in this panopticon now, where if men in some way make a woman uncomfortable without even meaning to, that could be filmed and put on social media, and it could ruin that man's life. So I really empathize with younger men, because it's you guys are getting a green light and a red light at the same time, and it's why aren't you guys moving? It's well, where are they supposed to go? This is really confusing.
And we're also seeing, in terms of corporate America, for example, actions like we saw from Gillette. So at the kind of height of the Me Too campaign, which had many worthy aspects to it, as did the Time Up campaign, I certainly saw a merit in exposing a lot of very bad men for doing very bad things. But with all these things, the pendulum swung wildly and hooked in a lot of people where I felt the punishment that they were receiving in terms of cancellation and so on way outdid what they were supposed to have done.
So the Me Too movement was both a really good thing and a really bad thing. As with any large movement that happens in society, we were able to identify really important patterns of abuse and exploitation and predation that should have been exposed. And thank God we now know about Weinstein and Epstein and Cosby and Nassar. But I think what went wrong is what we concluded from it, because we didn't come out of that movement saying like, oh, power can corrupt, or predators tend to seek positions of power, or we need to be really careful with systems that allow people to have unchecked access to vulnerable groups. And I think what happened instead is we had all gotten so used to seeing all these men that we formerly trusted and then realizing that they were actually doing these horrible things. I think it tricked a lot of us into thinking that men are inherently dangerous. And I think that that's where that toxic masculinity narrative comes from. But predators are not predators because they have toxic masculinity. They generally have antisocial traits, and that combined with authority and impunity usually doesn't end super well, especially when they're in systems that fail to hold them accountable. And that exact same power dynamic exists when female perpetrators also have those conditions. And women can be just as terrible as men can be. We all know that Ghislaine really paved the way for Epstein. So I think culturally the solution was like, oh, we need more women in power. We need less men in power. When the reality is that what we should have taken from this is that the solution is that we should fix systems that enable abuse in the first place, so anyone who abuses power is accountable for their behavior.
But you look at it in totality, all that, and I just saw a kind of reaction from corporate America. Gillette was a prime example where they'd always done these kind of chest-beating alpha male style commercials that were a celebration of masculinity, a celebration of strong men often holding babies and so on, being men, being masculine with all the traits that we would associate with being men, being hunters, providers, protectors, nurturers, being stoic, being strong, being courageous, being risk-taking, all those kind of things which I think make men great things, actually, in the vast majority of cases. But Gillette spun that on its head. And I write about this in my book, Woke is Dead, where they turned it on its head and almost were saying all men are awful until they can prove otherwise. They ran a whole lot of footage of Harvey Weinstein and all this kind of thing.
And I think that commercial is actually really demonstrative of what went wrong culturally, because it treats men as a group, as the cause of sexual violence, instead of identifying individual perpetrators who were enabled by systems of power or access or didn't have any accountability.
And the presumption was men are not the best that they can be. They have to prove they're not these awful Harvey Weinsteins. And it backfired horrendously for them. I think $8 billion later, off the bottom line, Gillette did a screeching U-turn and went back to celebrating men. But it was the fact they'd taken that decision to kind of go that way in flipping things on its head and making men really hate themselves until they could prove otherwise.
So seeing that self-hatred in men was really the first thing that started me down this rabbit hole, because in my clinical practice, I was working with these men who were just like really objectively good people. And they all like had this belief that they caused harm or that they were bad. And I was like, this is so weird that all of these men have this. And I just couldn't figure out what it was. And so I went down this whole rabbit hole and now here we are. But I really think that, especially for young men, like the last decade has been anti-man, our whole culture. And if you are a man, the culture has been anti-you. And I think it really is the case that our culture has really made men internalize this self-hatred. And it's honestly one of the biggest reasons why I made this channel, because I was like, this is really bad. I was like, this isn't your hatred. This hatred was put on you. You shouldn't hate yourself. You're a good man. Because the reality that all this anti-man messaging, this doesn't affect men who don't care. Men who are bad men are like, okay. This sort of rhetoric only hurts good men. And I find that very disturbing. So this wasn't like the spiciest interview that Piers Morgan has done in recent history, but I thought it was pretty good. I generally like Scott Galloway. I think that he has a really good economic analysis of some of the things that have gone wrong, and then I think he gives advice to men kind of in the way that like a dad would give advice to his son. So it's not always like perfectly nuanced. It's not always like super considerate of every single variable, but I think generally it points men in a pretty good direction. In terms of like male advocacy people, he's probably my third favorite. My second would probably have to be Richard Reeves, and then my first would obviously be Andrew Tate. So I think, I'm just kidding, it's Warren Farrell. Love Warren Farrell. I would love to hear what you guys think about this interview, and I also think it would be fun to know who your favorite male advocacy influencer people are. We can compare them like it's 2006 and we're listing our best friends on MySpace. You know, might be some fun engagement. I would love to know what you guys thought of this interview. I've never done a video like this before. It was definitely like the most informal thing that I've ever put on my YouTube channel. When I was little, I used to always have people come up to me and be like, "Your name is Gabby? You sure must talk a lot." And as I was editing this, I was like, oh, they were right. But hopefully, you know, I'll get better at it. That's how these things go. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoy my content and would like to see more of me, make sure you like and subscribe. And please go take care of the men and boys in your life, and I will talk to you later.